Let's get more on that for you. Noah Abu El-Dahab is visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Centre. Where are we with the diplomacy as of today?
Well, there have been, it's been several days of very intensive sort of shuttle diplomacy. The Qatari foreign minister has been in Washington and New York in the last few days. We're going to need to see some stronger statements coming out of the U.S., I believe, as we near the deadline for meeting the list of demands. Thus far, as we know from the beginning of this crisis, the U.S. sort of has had a very sort of contradictory messages coming from the Trump administration and from the State Department. So we'll have to see some stronger statements, certainly coming out of the U.S.
And when the Qatari foreign minister does his round-robin thing that he's been doing now for, the best part of 3 weeks, I guess, is it significant that the response that we get from people he's talking to either comes down into two categories? Category one, it is, guys, sort it out for yourselves because you cannot sustain this situation. Or the other category of reaction is basically, look, Saudi Arabia, we don't understand why you're doing this, why you're driving this. You can work this out, but why you're pushing this as a big issue, nobody really understands it. There seems to be those two reactions in my mind to people when they have the Qatari case laid out in front of them.
Right. Well, absolutely. I mean, Category 1, as you call it, hasn't been very helpful in the sense that the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis have sort of been sort of escalating their statements with regards to, pressuring trade partners. The demands are non-negotiable. What's interesting is that in the last hour or two, the Saudi foreign minister tweeted that the demands regarding terrorism are non-negotiable. So sort of this specification is interesting. It may mean that, it may sort of open the window to negotiations on some of the other demands. But I mean, in comparison to the other demands, such as, well, in particular, the request for Qatar to align its policies militarily, economically, socially with the GCC, the terrorism demand, the halting of funding is relatively straightforward. Now, the list of demands has sort of confirmed that it's much more than just about funding terrorism. So yeah, it's absolutely much more complicated, and I think that already we have seen statements from Tillerson expressing frustration with sort of where these demands are coming from and what
has to change for this kind of diplomatic momentum to turn into diplomatic inertia? What has to shift or change here? Because the Saudis must have known those 13 demands, at least 3 of them were never going to fly as far as the Qataris were concerned, as far as Qatar was concerned. So this one particular issue about, quote, terrorism, terrorists, is that something that they could park everything else on the back burner and actually talk about one particular issue and therefore get some sort of movement going?
Well, if it were just about terrorism, then this would have been a much easier crisis to resolve. But it's about much more than that. It's about, Qatar's pursuit of independent foreign policy. It's its support for Muslim Brotherhood figures. Its sort of hub as a negotiating platform for warring parties that the Gulf neighbors don't necessarily feel comfortable with. I think that it was Senator Bob Corker's statement the other day about the possibility of halting the U.S. arms sales with Saudi Arabia is very important because it could have a very sort of significant impact on the course of this crisis. So if the U.S. were to follow through on such a possibility, I think then we might see some change in the approach from the Saudis.
Very briefly here, is there a chance that the allies against Qatar are being slightly short-sighted here and or slightly disingenuous, in as much as there is this central accusation there are people in Doha that the Qataris should not be dealing with? That's the main Saudi claim. But if you look at terrorist organizations over the past 30 years, there have always been back-channel conversations with terrorists. The John Major government in London spoke to the IRA via Sinn Féin. People obviously have been talking to the FARC in Colombia. That's why there is now a peace treaty in play there. People were talking to the Cuban government out of Washington. Those lines, those conduits of communication, of course they exist, and that's how you get to peace talks with people eventually at some point down the line.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that you know, the counter-terrorism narrative is a very powerful one. I think that the Saudis and the Emiratis and Bahrainis sort of banked on this narrative as a sort of tool to draw support from external actors such as the U.S. And they've been taken aback by the initial reaction, which is Qatar has stood its ground. It's used that exact same argument that you just mentioned, that, you know, it's a hub for diplomatic negotiations, and that means that you have to, you know, engage with those actors. So I think it's really just been sort of a narrative that they thought would be much more powerful than it actually has been.
No, we must leave it there. Many thanks.
Thank you.